Good evening. My name is Ben Nash. I am a senior from San Diego, California, living in Alumni Hall. Go Dogs. And I'm studying philosophy and theology, the good stuff. Right on. This year, I have the great privilege of serving as the director of the Department of Faith in Notre Dame Student Government. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight and to introduce our distinguished speaker. First, some words of gratitude. Thank you to Father Pete McCormick, Director of Campus Ministry, Dr. John Cavadini, Director of the McGrath Institute for Church Life, and Professor Carter Sneed, Director of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture, for co-sponsoring this lecture. I'm especially grateful to Dr. Tim O'Malley and Margaret Cabanis, who have been a constant help to me in organizing this event. Thank you to Kate Barrett and Father Brian Ching for coordinating the celebration of Holy Mass earlier today. Thank you to John Barron, to everyone at Word on Fire, as well as to Amber Kirk for all your help these last several weeks. Thank you to Patrick Lee, our student body president, along with Sophie Stitt and Nicole Bauman, for your wholehearted support of this amazing initiative. And lastly, thank you, Your Excellency, for accepting our invitation back in the fall to deliver tonight's address. If the size of this audience is any indication, our speaker tonight is hardly in need of an introduction, but I will provide one nonetheless. Bishop Robert Barron is the bishop of the Diocese of Winona-Rochester in Minnesota and the founder of Word on Fire Catholic Ministries. He is the host of Catholicism, a groundbreaking award-winning documentary about the Catholic faith, which aired on PBS. Bishop Barron's more recent film series, Catholicism, The Pivotal Players, has won an Emmy Award and has been syndicated for national television. Bishop Barron is a #1 Amazon best-selling author and has published numerous books, essays, and articles on theology and the spiritual life. Bishop Barron's website, wordonfire.org, reaches millions of people each year. He has made many appearances on major cable news networks, and he is one of the world's most followed Catholics on social media. He has engaged in dialogue with Dr. Jordan Peterson, Lex Friedman, Dave Rubin, Ben Shapiro, and William Lane Craig, among other influencers and thought leaders. And he has been invited to speak about religion at the headquarters of Facebook, Google, and Amazon. He has keynoted many conferences and events all over the world, including the 2016 World Youth Day in Krakow and the 2015 World Meeting of Families in Philadelphia, which marked Pope Francis's historic visit to the United States. On a more personal note, Bishop Barron has been instrumental in my own intellectual and spiritual formation, and I know Patrick, our student body president, would say the same. He provided an accessible entryway into the thought of St. John Henry Newman, among others, and his Pivotal Players series is truly in a league of its own as an introduction to the key figures who have shaped our tradition. He was a dear pastoral presence to my family in Southern California for many years, and I know he will bless the lives of the faithful in Minnesota for years to come. It is an incredible grace and joy to have him with us tonight at Our Lady's University. Please join me in welcoming to the stage His Excellency, Bishop Robert Barron.
Well, thank you, everybody. Ben, thank you for that very nice introduction. And some might have been at Mass earlier today when I signaled the great joy it is for me always to come back here to Notre Dame. I was here as a squirrely little freshman in 1977. And I came back many years later as a visiting scholar in 2002. I lived at Moreau Seminary. But I want to go back to those earliest days, 1977, 78. It was a great year, by the way, for Notre Dame sports, if you remember. That's the year football team won the national championship, and the basketball team was in the Final Four. So that was a very cool year to be here. The following year, I entered the seminary in Chicago and then went to Catholic U from there, and things went on. But I always had this great affection for Notre Dame. And there's Father Tom McNally right there. I was going to mention him. I don't know if you know Father Tom, a great Holy Cross priest. But when I was this squirrely young freshman in 1977, I was thinking about the priesthood, for the first time. And somehow I was directed, Father Tom, to see you. He lived at Old College in those days. And I went down there and we had, spiritual conversations, and he played a big role in my vocational discernment. And I still have the book. I don't know if you remember. He said to me, he listened to me a little bit and knew I was interested in the life of the mind. And he said, the book you need to get is John Henry Newman's Apologia Pro Vita Sua. I had heard neither of Newman nor of that book at that point, but he said, go to the bookstore. And I did. Remember some might remember the bookstore wasn't always where it is now. And I went there, and it was a little red paperback about this big. I still have it. And that set me on a path that I've really never left. So God bless you, Father Tom. Great seeing you. As I mentioned, I came back in 2002 as a kind of visiting scholar. I started work on a book of mine called The Priority of Christ, and I taught a course here. And I had the great joy of living at Moreau Seminary that year, and Father Bill Campbell, who's here, was the rector in those days. My new colleague up in Minnesota, Bishop Pat Neary, was the vice rector. And then a number of guys, I saw them at Mass, and some here were students at various levels, and to see them here now on the faculty gives me a great joy. So it is wonderful to be back. When I got the letter a couple months ago, I said to my secretary, yes, I want to do that. I want to go back to Notre Dame. So thank you for having me. Now, I want to talk to you about the nature of a Catholic university. And I know there's been a lot written and a lot done on this topic, and there's a lot of different ways to approach it. I can't exhaust them all. But let me just state a thesis, and I'm going to try to demonstrate it in the course of the talk. Here's the thesis. A lot of things we could say, but essentially a Catholic university is one in which Christ holds the central and organizing place among all the disciplines and activities of the university. Let me just say that again as a thesis statement. A Catholic university is one in which Christ holds the central, integrating, and organizing place among all the circle of disciplines and activities at the university. In saying that, I stand in the tradition of the man that Tom McNally introduced me to long ago. So John Henry Newman, mid-19th century, said, theology, which was being kicked out of the circle of university disciplines at the time, Newman raised his voice in protest and said, no, if you're a true university, you must include religion. But more to the point, it can't simply be one topic among many, but has to play a central and organizing role. Those who follow my work will know that I love to use the rose window of the Gothic churches as an image, because think of the center of the rose, which is always Christ, and it provides the anchor to the whole design. So all the elements of the window revolve around and find their unity in that central place. That's the role that Christ plays, it seems to me, in a great Catholic university. In saying this, too, I go back before the 19th century to the 13th century and St. Bonaventure, who said, if Christ is not just one teacher among many, but rather is the incarnate Logos, he's the very word and mind of God, well, then all the logoi that make up the other disciplines, all the subordinate studies, must find their center in him. Mind you, he can't be one logos among many, but must be the central, integrating, and unifying principle of all the other disciplines. So there's Newman, 19th century, Bonaventure, 13th century, and in a very minor and humble way, I'm trying to stand in the 21st century in that tradition. I think a great Catholic university is one in which the relationship between Christ and all the other disciplines and activities is celebrated and explored with enthusiasm. That's the way I'd put it. It's a place where the relationship between Christ, the Logos, and all the other disciplines and activities is explored and celebrated. Okay, now before looking at this in terms of several particular studies, I want to make a general remark, which is very important, I think, to justify the claim I'm making and to avoid the critique that I'm advocating some kind of epistemological imperialism, whereby theology comes in with both elbows and moves everybody out of the way. I'm in the central place, you get out. To make that epistemological point, we have to make a more fundamental metaphysical point. And this is it. And the theologians and philosophers, I hope, know this from our great Catholic tradition. God is not a being. In fact, when you read the new atheist, or actually the old atheists too, they all make that mistake of assuming God is a being among many. Some say he's there, some say he's not. Well, that's precisely the wrong way to think about God. When Thomas Aquinas says, for example, that God is not in any genus, not even the genus of being, he's making this point. We say, well, look, all beings, this room, all of us in it, the planet Jupiter, the Notre Dame Stadium, wherever it is, that way, I guess. Well, they're all beings. Right? I'm a human being. You're human beings. This is a building, and that's a stadium. I can categorize and place in various genera the things that I see in the world. Aquinas says, and it's one of the most mysterious observations he makes. It's almost like a Zen koan in a way. God is not in any genus, not even the genus of being. God is not one thing among many. Now, if he were, and this is a very important point in Catholic spirituality too, if he were, he'd be in a competitive relationship. If I'm going to move into your space, you better move out of it, right? It's just the way it goes. If I'm going to destroy that stadium, something else is going to move into its place. Beings are in a competitive relationship. God's not a being. Aquinas calls him not en summum, highest being, but rather ipsum esse. It's lovely in his Latin. It means to be itself. I doubt he's here. Father David Barron. Some of you know him. David was a great mentor to me, a great philosopher and theologian here. And David made this point this way. To be God is to be. To be me is to be a human being. To be that is a stadium. To be Jupiter is to be a planet. So what does it mean to be God? To be God is to be. When Moses says to God, hey, now, what's your name? He's asking a very commonsensical question, right? What kind of being are you? There are a lot of beings. In fact, lots of gods. Gods of this place and that place, God of the mountain, God of the river. Which one are you? What's your name? God's answer, which could be construed as stop asking me stupid questions, right? But Aquinas reads it, I am who I am. To be God is to be to be. God is not in any genus, not even the genus of being. The upshot of that, everybody, is that this God does not compete with us. There's nothing more important, it seems to me, in theology and spirituality is that insight. God does not compete with us. So many problems spiritually, by the way, flow from misunderstanding this. Rather, now go back to that Moses story, the image of the bush that's on fire but not consumed. That's the place from which the divine voice comes. When the true God comes close to creation, God makes it luminous and beautiful and does not compromise it, does not destroy it, but rather elevates it. So with us, the closer God gets, the more alive we are. That's why Irenaeus can say, Gloria Dei homo vivens, right? The glory of God is a human being fully alive. God's not in the business of supplanting us or dominating us, but rather of lifting us up and making us luminous and beautiful. Now, you see, that's a metaphysical point, but it supports the epistemological point that I began with. If I say theology is the central, integrating, and unifying discipline in a great Catholic university, what don't I mean? I don't mean theology comes crashing in and push the physicists aside, and pushing the chemists aside, and pushing the mathematicians aside, and pushing the literary figures aside, and pushing the philosophers aside. No. God enhances and makes luminous and beautiful. God opens up a depth dimension to all these disciplines. And that's what I'm talking about when I describe a great Catholic university. It's one in which this depth dimension of all of the disciplines is celebrated and explored. If you take one thing away from my talk, everybody, take away that idea of what my mentor, Robert Sokolowski, calls the non-competitive transcendence of God. That's beautiful. God's transcendent. Yes, indeed, because God's not a being. So where's God? Well, God's nowhere in this room because God's not a being. Oh, God's up there somewhere. Well, no, he's not up there. Where's God? Everywhere. Because God is ipsum esse. God is sustaining, Aquinas says, all things by essence, presence, and power, and most intimately so. That's the non-competitive transcendence of God. So I would argue theology has a sort of non-competitive transcendent relationship to the other disciplines. And that's what makes a Catholic university great, truly Catholic. Okay? Now what I want to do is try to show this to you in a very simple way. It'll have to be superficial in the short time we have, by looking at a number of areas. And don't worry, this is not going to be super detailed for each one. I'll just give you a little sketch. I want to look at mathematics, the physical sciences, history, literature, and law. You're thinking, what did I get myself into tonight? How long will this guy go on? Trust me, I won't go on that long. I just want to give you an idea for each one of what it would mean for all these disciplines to be in relationship to Christ, to be in relationship to the Logos. So that's the program. Let's start with mathematics. How many mathematicians are here? We have some math students? Good. Years ago, when I was a kid, I was a teenager, I read Bertrand Russell's History of Philosophy. So Russell, with Sartre, probably the most famous atheist of the 20th century. And Russell made a remark, he was talking about the ancient Greeks, and he meant it, I'm sure, as a debunking remark, but actually it's a very insightful one. He said, the origin of our idea of the eternal is found in mathematics. And again, I say he probably meant it debunking. We're like, well, that's all these religious people. It's just their minds are beguiled by mathematics. But that's actually a very insightful and interesting remark. The opening of the door, I'd put it this way, to the eternal is mathematics. Now, how come? When we grasp a mathematical truth, something as simple as a number, the number 7. Now, I don't mean this. I don't mean the physical symbol that we use. I don't mean, oh, I'm looking at 7 things. I mean when I grasp in its essence the number 7. I have, in a very real sense, stepped out of this world. By this world, I mean the world of evanescent, ordinary experience, full of things that come and go, pure contingencies, etc. When I grasp the quadratic formula, not the symbols that we use to indicate it, but when I grasp the truth of it, I've grasped something that is true across space and time, that's true in any possible world, that's true no matter what, that doesn't change in its truth. I have, as Russell quite rightly said, stepped into a properly eternal order. Now, philosophers here, in Philosophy 101, we all read Plato's Republic and the famous parable of the cave, right? We're like these people that were chained in place, and all we see are the flickering images, the shadows on the wall. Well, that's our ordinary experience of the world. You know, here you all are in front of me in this exciting space, and 2 hours from now, it's all going to be gone. We're all going to be in different places. We all come and we go. That's the world of ordinary experience. Well, when the man finally escapes from the cave and he makes his way out, what's the first move? Plato says it's into the world of the mathematical. It's into a mathematical order that I take my first steps toward a contemplation of the forms, of the higher eternal realities. So it still goes, it seems to me. Mathematics introduces me to a properly invisible world. You know, in the Nicene Creed, when we say, and we believe in one God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible. Angels, okay, sure. Pure numbers, pure mathematical intelligibilities. Those don't belong to the world of ordinary, evanescent, passing experience. Those are invisible things. Can I quote somebody here? Maybe some remember this name, David Tracy. When I was coming of age, would have been like the leading Catholic theologian in the world, taught at the University of Chicago. He's now in retirement. But just recently he wrote an article called The Ultimate Invisible. And I want to share a couple quotes from that article. Tracy says this: aside from the religions, the major form of invisibility in our time is that provided by mathematics and the mathematization of modern science nurtured in the early modern period by Galileo. So religion talks about invisible reality. Yeah, but so does mathematics. Here's something, again, Tracy's example. What's a circle? I can draw a circle. I could see an image of a circle. But that's not a circle. A circle is a locus of coplanar points equidistant from its center. Right? There's a pure mathematical definition. I defy anyone in this room to imagine such a thing accurately or depict it accurately. You can't, right? I don't care how perfect your compass is. I don't care how perfect your artistic ability is. I don't care how vivid your imagination is. Nobody can imagine or produce a locus of coplanar points absolutely equidistant from its center. I have to step out of the ordinary world and move into a higher world. What's a circle? Here's Tracy. We can't answer that question at the level of the visible. I'm quoting now. We can answer it, but only by moving into a realm of intelligent supposing, a realm that can be neither seen nor imagined, but can be supposed and understood. When I step into the mathematical world, I'm stepping into a different, higher, stranger world. One, I would argue, that touches upon the absolutely pure intelligibility, finally, of God. Here's something that Tracy says now. I'll close this section with this. He says, the sciences come to the end of their capacity when they confront the puzzling limit question which they, on their own terms, couldn't possibly address, namely, why there should be these intelligibilities at all. Now, I'm going to link this to my next section, but as I look out into the world of evanescent passing things, I also notice these sheer intelligible realities described by mathematics. Where do they come from? Why should they be there? They open me to, in fact, a realm beyond that of ordinary experience. If we look back at Plato, you escape from the cave, you go through the mathematical, and then you come to the purely formal, and then you look up, Plato says, to the sun, which is the luminous origin of all the intelligibility of the world. You look up toward the pure intelligibility of God. Bertrand Russell was right. The entrance to our sense of the eternal is through mathematics. I think a Catholic university is a place where that very interesting relationship is explored and celebrated. Okay, that's math. Got that figured out. You know, so let me share something with you based on my experience with my evangelical work on the internet. Is I find with non-believers, agnostics, atheists, and so on, and who claim rationality. They're the avatars of rationality, and you religious people are superstitious and stuck in the Middle Ages and all this. But I find that they get very uncurious precisely when the questions get really interesting. You know, like this one. Like, why should there be pure intelligibilities at all? Why should that be the case? Oh, I don't know. It's just the way it is. Oh, I don't know. I think it's a very interesting question. This is a great place to explore it. Okay, let's go now from that to the physical sciences. And as Tracy is suggesting, there is a very strong relationship. How come? Because all the sciences rest upon the fundamental presumption that the reality they go out to meet is imbued with intelligibility. It's imbued with something like a pattern or form that can be understood, that corresponds to the inquiring mind. I don't know if some who are interested in the sciences here know the name John Polkinghorne. It's kind of a funny name. John Polkinghorne died just a couple years ago. He was a high-level Cambridge particle physicist who at midlife became an Anglican priest and then spent the last maybe 30 years of his life writing very compellingly about religion and science. But Polkinghorne took as a basic argument for God's existence the intelligibility of the world, upon which all the sciences have to depend. Look in, so whether it's biology, it's chemistry, it's physics, it's psychology, it's geology. Look at all those logoi, by the way, right? Logos, logos, logos. They all assume intelligible patterns that the mind can know. Go from Polkinghorne to Joseph Ratzinger in his Introduction to Christianity, basing his argument on the same insight. Says the only way finally to explain the universal intelligibility of our experience is through recourse to a creative and personal intelligence that has thought it into being. Now, just to be clear about something, I'm not talking about intelligent design here, leaving that to the side. I'm talking about something much more fundamental, that being in its elemental structures as we experience it is intelligible. Sciences wouldn't exist without that. How do you explain it? Ratzinger says the only finally convincing way is through appeal to a personal intelligence that has already thought it into being. And he makes this observation, which I think is interesting. Our word to recognize something. I recognize the truth. Well, what is that but recognizing it? Is I'm thinking again what has already been thought. I'm deriving an intelligibility which I haven't placed there. I'm discovering an intelligibility which has already been thought into it. This too from Einstein himself making the same point. Einstein didn't reflect in a very disciplined way philosophically, but often delivered himself of these wonderful lapidary sort of statements. Here's one. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. And that is, see, we take it so for granted. Oh, of course. But why of course? See, there's my internet interlocutors again. Well, that's just the way it is. Really? That's your answer? It's just the way it is? This universal, densely mathematically complex intelligibility. Ratzinger's answer, and the answer of our great tradition, is only in recourse to a creative intelligence does it make sense. Here's one for the scientists, for the physicists. I just came across this article not that long ago and then discovered this marvelous literature that it's generated. It's a 1960 article written by the physicist Eugene Wigner. Not a household name, but he'd be a younger contemporary of people like Einstein and Niels Bohr, that generation of physicists. Wigner was not a religious man, he was a secular Jew. But he wrote this article in 1960, which, as I say, has generated a huge commentary tradition. Here's the title. The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Physical Sciences. It's a very cool title. Think about that again. The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Physical Sciences. Again, this is a non-believer, but a high-level scientist, reflecting on the fact that isn't it weird, isn't it unreasonable, strange that as I look out at the world, I find that the highest and most complex kind of mathematics describes it. In fact, so accurately that I can do things like build bridges and I can do all sorts of complex engineering projects based upon this mathematically precise intelligibility. Why should that be the case? As I say, Wigner's not religious, but he uses the word miracle 9 times in this short article. Seems like a miracle. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Well, we religious people, what do we know? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And through this Word, all things came to be. That's not a bad explanation. That the one responsible for physical reality must be someone like a mathematician, must be someone like a logos-bearing person. I think that's a really interesting question to explore. It's been said that the two conditions for the possibility of the emergence of the modern physical sciences are both theological in form, namely, that the world is not God. As long as you think the world is God, and many religions and mysticisms do, right, that the world is divine. Well, I'm not going to analyze it and cut it apart and do experiments on it. It's divine, right? So the first move is, well, the world is not God. But the second move is, but it's radically and universally intelligible. Those are both theological assumptions because they're born of the doctrine of creation. A created world isn't divine. It's other than God. But at the same time, a created world has been spoken intelligently into being. I think a Catholic university is a place where these questions, these very intriguing questions, like the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics and the physical sciences, where those are celebrated and explored. Okay, we got mathematics, now we figured out science. No, but I hope what's the last thing I'm going to do as a Catholic bishop and a theologian? Come into the physics classroom, give me the chalk there, and let me, well, no, but that's not at all what I'm talking about. That none of this that I'm describing, this kind of opening up of a depth dimension, is meant to elbow anybody out of place. Okay, let's go from the sciences now to the humanities. History. You know, the famous cynical account of it. What's history? It's just one damn thing after another, right? And so I suppose you could say history is just, accounting for the one damn thing after another. But there's hardly any historian of any period from the early, Greeks on who actually do history that way, where it's simply kind of dumb reportage. Almost every historian I know, ancient, medieval, modern, contemporary, would also do something like an exploration of a meta-narrative. In other words, some exploration of the meaning of history, the meaning of what's happening, some sense of overarching pattern that obtains within history. I'll come back to him, but St. Augustine invents this, you could say, in the City of God, invents the discipline of philosophy of history. But in more contemporary times, think of Hegel, the German philosopher, who probably, most famously for moderns, proposes this sort of meta-historical account. It's not just one damn thing after another, but rather it's the unfolding of absolute spirit, the unfolding of the Weltgeist, through a dialectical process, et cetera. The Hegelian sort of grand overview. See, we know it better through Hegel's disciple, his left-wing political disciple, Karl Marx, who took in Hegel, but then, as Marx famously put it, turned Hegel on his head. So it's no longer the unfolding of absolute spirit, but rather history is the materially dialectical movement of warring economic systems, moving inevitably toward pure communism. So things are happening, but they've got a pattern, they've got a meaning. One that we should be very familiar with, we Americans, we secular Westerners, is not so much Hegel or Marx, although Marx, to my mind, sadly, is making a comeback. But the meta-narrative of, call it modern liberalism. I know that's a slippery word. You just call it secular modernity if you want. What's that meta-narrative? And trust me, all of us in this room, we all live within this meta-narrative. That there was a long, long period of obscurantism and oppression. And then in the 17th century, largely, and into the 18th century, there was this marvelous enlightenment focused on the physical sciences that overcame all these centuries of obscurantism, often tied to religion, by the way, in this meta-narrative. So enlightenment, science, and then the other side of this, in the 18th century, the great political revolutions, especially in France and America, which threw off the burden and the chains of tyranny and opened the way toward greater and greater liberation. So history reached a kind of climax in the 17th and 18th century. That was the breakthrough. That was the Aufklärung, the enlightenment of knowledge and of liberty. And now we're living in the period after that where we embrace ever greater enlightenment and ever greater liberation. Any of that sound familiar? I mean, that's the narrative that we all live in. I'm not going to descend into details of the COVID situation, but I always found it interesting during COVID. The science says. Now, look, I love science. I mean, science saved my life twice. If there wasn't modern science, I'd be dead. You know, I love the modern. I don't want to go back to putting leeches on people to deal with their humors. I mean, I love it. So don't get me wrong. But the kind of reverence, because in that liberal modern meta-narrative, that was the great moment, the Aufklärung, the Enlightenment, you know. And of course, the other side of it is liberation. In the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and finally freedom over tyranny, and now more and more and more forms of liberation. You know what's interesting, as I tell this story, you don't have to, I'll do it for you here. If you go look at your dollar bill, you can see this. On the back of the dollar bill, you know this, there's a pyramid with the eye on top, right? So it's kind of a Masonic thing. And the eye is the eye of God, of providence. And what he says on top is annuit ceptus, you know, which is, it's a little tricky Latin, but it means he nods toward the new things. God nods toward the new things. These people didn't think they were just, you know, implementing a few little political reforms. I mean, they thought they were starting something dramatically, cosmically new. And then look at the bottom, it says, under the pyramid, it says, Novus Ordo Seclorum. This is not just a little minor political reform. This is a new order of the ages. It's in the back of our money, you know. But what I mean is, this is a good example of the modern liberal meta-narrative. So, look, I've been laying out, there's a Marxist version, there's a Hegelian version, there's this modern liberal version. What's the Christian meta-narrative? It's not that history climaxed in the 17th and 18th centuries. It's not that history is the story of the unfolding of the Weltgeist. It's not history is the movement inevitably toward pure communism. We think history came to its climax on this squalid hill outside of Jerusalem around the year 30, when this young rabbi is dying on an instrument of torture. We think the dying and the rising of the Son of God is the climax of history. When the great story of Israel, commencing with creation, moving through the fall, moving through the formation of a holy people, Israel, and then coming to its climax in the arrival of the Mashiach, the Anointed One, who died for the sins of the world and rose for their justification, that's the climax of history. What's the rest of time and space but the unfolding of that story, the story of the church, if you want, or of the lordship of Jesus, the lordship of the crucified one. How wonderful, and maybe if you follow my work, you've heard me talk about this, but when the first Christians said, Jesus Kyrios, Paul says it all the time in his Greek. It means Jesus is Lord. And we say, well, that's a nice religious thing to say. But that was a revolutionary thing to say. Because the watchword of the time was Kaiser Kyrios. Now, the Romans, by the way, they had their version of this, of the meta-narrative, didn't they? Read Virgil if you want to see it. That all of history came to its climax with Augustus Caesar and with the Pax Romana. That was their meta-narrative. Paul says, not Kaiser Kyrios, but Jesus Kyrios. This guy that Caesar nailed to a cross, but God raised him from the dead. He's the climax of history, and he's the true Lord. In the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, when he says, I've got this euangelion, right? We say gospel, but that was an imperial term that he was purposely adopting to tweak their noses. Because you sent evangelists ahead of you when the Roman emperor won a great victory. And the euangelion was, hey, Caesar won. Hey, Rome is on top of the world. And Mark, he's in the belly of the beast, if it's true that Mark was a companion of St. Peter in Rome. And just after the deaths of Peter and Paul, he has the moxie to say, no, the real euangelion doesn't have a thing to do with Caesar. It has to do with this Jesus. And then I love how he calls him in the Greek, Weos tutau, which means son of the god, right? Son of God. Well, who was the son of the god? It was the Roman emperor, because Julius Caesar, and of course, I'm from Chicago. I know about Julius Caesar. He was a canny street politician. And I know what Julius Caesar was like. Read Chicago political history. But when he died, they made him a god, right? Well, then he has his adopted son, Octavian, who then becomes Weos tutau. He's the son of the god. So here's Mark saying, I've got the real Evangelion, and he's the real son of God. Do you see, this famous quote from an Anglican bishop from the last century, and he said, when Paul preached, there were riots. When I preached, they served me tea. And his point was, authentic Christian preaching is subversive. It always has been. It's revolutionary because it proposes a new and definitive meta-history that centers on Jesus crucified and risen from the dead. What would history look like if we take seriously that that's the meta-narrative? I think a Catholic university is a place where that question, supremely interesting in my judgment, would be explored. Okay, I'm going to just do two more, and then I promise I'll stop. Let me look at literature just briefly. The greatest American novelist of the 20th century, I think, William Faulkner, wins the Nobel Prize in 1950 and gives a famous acceptance speech in which he said, the only thing finally worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself. It's a splendid line. I think it's dead right. You look at all of literature, and they're about all kinds of different things, from the Iliad to Moby Dick and everything else in between. But finally, what they're all about is the human heart in conflict with itself. So, whether you're Dante, Cervantes, Dickens, Dostoevsky, Joyce, Flannery O'Connor, all of them, at bottom, are talking about that reality. Now, the human heart gets in conflict with itself about lots of things. We all know that. But what's the basic thing that it gets in conflict over? Well, Augustine named it long ago, page 1 of the Confessions. Lord, you've made us for yourself. Therefore, our heart is restless until it rests in thee. Best one-liner in the history of Christian anthropology. There's no better summary statement of the Christian understanding of humanity. Lord, you've made us for yourself, therefore our heart, and again, Augustine says cor nostrum. He doesn't say our hearts, meaning it's the one thing we all have in common. The one thing we all have in common is we got restless hearts because they're finally hungry for God. Where's our basic problem come from? And see, Augustine here is echoing the Psalms and the whole of the Bible. Our basic problem comes when we hook our infinite desire for God onto something less than God. Bible calls that idolatry. It names it as the fundamental spiritual and psychological problem we face, right? All of our suffering, all of the degradation of human life comes from that basic spiritual mistake. Read the Bible end to end for the details there. What brings the human heart into conflict with itself is this painful up and down, back and forth, one step forward, 4 steps backward relationship with God, our hunger and our thirst for God. I'm convinced, everybody, that at bottom, all literature is pointing in that direction. If we get into any poem, any story, any novel, any play, and we find, oh, there's the place where the human heart's in conflict with itself, at bottom that opens up onto a hunger and a thirst for God, either properly or improperly directed. What did Flannery O'Connor say? And a few of her stories, you might say, are explicitly religious, but most of them aren't. Most of them, you'd say, there's kind of these weird Southern Gothic stories. But she said, my stories are always about the offer of grace, usually refused. Once you see that, her stories just become luminously clear. It's the offer of grace. In other words, there's the hungry heart that wants grace. The grace breaks through, and it's usually refused. And I would argue, whether you're talking about Captain Ahab or you're talking about any figure in literature, that finally the heart in conflict with itself opens up to that divine ground. Longing for God, hating God, running from God, resenting God, weeping over God, denying and loving God at the same time. That's what we finally wrestle with. And I think a Catholic university would be a great place where that relationship, that question is explored in relation to literature. Okay, let me just do one more with you to show you this, again, non-competitive relationship between theological depth and the discipline in question. Last one I'll look at is law. And I know we got a great law school at Notre Dame with a wonderful reputation. Any law school people here? Good, good. Cardinal George, who was kind of a mentor to me, often remarked this, that modernity was so shaped by lawyers. People who were trained in law. And think here of Calvin, Luther, Jefferson, Madison, Robespierre. Many of the great founders of modernity and those revolutions I referenced earlier were trained in law. The modern liberal democracies are often described as highly litigious societies, and there's all kinds of reasons for that. But that lawyers are thick on the ground, and law plays a very important role in our societies. Now, it's easy enough to see law simply as a type of pragmatism, just the way that we kind of adjudicate disputes within a contentious, pluralistic society. But, and people here know it, the great classical tradition sees law as so much more than that. That law opens up onto morality, and morality opens up onto theology. That there's a relationship between law, morality, and God, which is inescapable. Aquinas, again, gives it classical expression when he says positive law. That means the laws on the books, from traffic laws to antitrust laws to income tax regulations, etc. Positive laws nest in a sort of Russian doll manner. They nest within the natural law or the moral law, that set of precepts that comes from the basic moral intelligibilities that obtain. So whether we call it life and knowledge and art and play and so on and so forth, these great values emerge. We realize we should always try to integrate them and never attack them. There's the foundation of the natural law. A positive law is good and just in the measure that it's grounded in the natural law. But then Aquinas argues that the natural law rests Russian doll-like in an even greater eternal law, which is identical to God's mind. So that these moral intelligibilities that we discern in the world come from the great Logos who gave rise to the world. Just as the intelligibilities explored by the sciences come from that same source, so the moral intelligibilities come from that source. Therefore, positive, natural, eternal law. If a law is just, it opens up finally onto God. Can I give you now... it's Aquinas, but I think one of the very best explications of this comes from a very American source, one that I love to cite, and that's Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham City Jail. You know, that great text. I'd recommend it to everybody. It's short text, but luminous text. You know, the issue was King had been arrested, as he often was, for his protests. And he finds himself in the Birmingham City Jail, and he receives a communique from a group of white pastors, so his fellow Christian pastors, who announced themselves as deeply sympathetic with King's cause, but who expressed concern about his methods and said, I just think, Dr. King, you're moving too fast. You're asking too much of people. You know, we're with you. We should work for racial and social justice, but you move it more slowly. So King, while he's in the Birmingham City Jail, decides to write a letter in response. And here's now the nettle of his answer, of why he feels we can't wait, why we have to act now. And I'm going to read this to you in its entirety. This is King. The answer is found in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just laws and unjust laws. I would agree, he says, with Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what's the difference between the two? How does one determine when a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code, positive law, that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that's out of harmony with the moral law. Now this is Martin Luther King. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. And that's why Martin Luther King concludes, I can't wait. That's why we can't wait, because we're dealing with unjust laws, which are not just problematic at the level of adjudicating practical disputes. They are problematic at the moral level, and finally problematic at the spiritual level. See, and everybody, this is true of any law, just or unjust. We should be able to show this relationship between the moral and the spiritual dimension. I don't know about you, but I think a Catholic university is a place where that extremely interesting question is explored and celebrated. Okay, let me draw it to a close. So, with the first principle of God's non-competitive transcendence, from which we derive the non-competitive transcendence of theology vis-a-vis the other disciplines. We've now seen with math, science, with history, with literature, and with law, how this thing obtains. John Paul II said, quite correctly, that universities emerged ex corde ecclesiae, right, from the heart of the church. That should be a point of pride, especially in a place like this. Just as the hospital system emerged from the church, just as, I argued, the physical sciences emerged out of theological assumptions, so the university itself, beginning with Bologna and with Paris and with Oxford and so on, began ex corde ecclesiae. I do think, everybody, one of the tragedies of our time is that we've forgotten that relationship. And at times have even set church and university at odds with each other. I'm here to argue precisely the contrary. The more we recover this idea of the university itself coming from the heart of the church, the more the university is authentically itself. And that's what a great Catholic university looks like. Thanks, everybody. God bless you for listening. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thank you so much for that lecture. That was excellent. Although it did feel a little bit like an advertisement for the program of liberal studies.
Good.
No.
Good.
No. Their egos are inflated enough. So you've wrought spiritual damage, unfortunately. But we'll take some time now for a Q&A. Thank you to those of you who submitted your questions. We sent out a survey to the entire student body. What's the question you have for Bishop Barron? And so we're going to try to move through as many as we can in the time that we have.
Yeah, let me just say before we start that I've done this for a long time. I don't like Q&A sessions, to be honest with you, because we know what I'm saying, because often people will just start giving speeches and then the speaker himself starts giving a second speech. So what I prefer is what we're doing here is just give me some questions and I'll try to give kind of punchy, short answers. So that's the way I kind of prefer, and we might get through a number of them then.
We'll try to move quickly. So you've laid out this thesis that a Catholic university is one whose integrating and animating principle is the person of Jesus Christ, and sort of what that looks like in all the disciplines. But what are some tangible or more concrete steps that Notre Dame or any Catholic university could take to enrich its Catholic identity?
In light of this talk, I'll say something just real quickly. Maybe more integration, where theology professors and physics professors and so on can talk to each other, or be present in each other's classes, can take time to entertain some of these questions that I mentioned tonight, that we overcome a certain siloing, among the disciplines, and let, have a little cross-pollination. I think that might be a good thing.
This person says, "Hey, Bishop."
Hey.
Okay. All right. It feels like it's been responded to. Why isn't the idea of a Catholic university a contradiction in terms?
No, it's the opposite. That's my whole talk. So that was... Yeah, that was submitted before my talk, so I hope the talk made that at least somewhat clear, that it's the opposite of a contradiction. And in fact, the university comes ex cordia ecclesiae. And if we see them as a contradiction, that's born of typically modern misunderstandings of the nature of a university and the nature of theology. So that exists. I mean, those misunderstandings are there, but I hope the talk was designed to answer precisely that question.
Our next question is, how should a Catholic university balance being a voice for Catholic thought in the world and being a leading scholastic community open to all perspectives?
Well, it depends what you mean by open there. Is it a place where many voices are heard and many ideas are explored? And yeah, of course. But to be a Catholic is to have certain convictions. So I'm not open to all perspectives. I mean, I'm not open to an atheist perspective. I'm happy to talk to atheists and to study them and read them, but I'm not really open to atheism. I'm opposed to it. I like to argue against it. I'm not open to communism. I'm against it. I want to argue in favor of something else. So I guess the whole openness thing... In that sense, I'm with someone like Stanley Hauerwas. I don't know if people read him anymore, but there's something kind of overrated in a way about openness. Or Chesterton, that the open mind is like the open mouth. It's meant finally to close down on something nourishing. If your mind is just open to all perspectives, then your brains fall out. You know what I'm saying? Is that finally your mind is meant to clamp down on something nourishing, right? Thank you.
How might a Catholic university like Notre Dame best share the gospel message and invite people into the Catholic tradition who are not Catholic or not religious at all?
Yeah, and never ever do that in an aggressive or overbearing or proselytizing way. I'll tell you, when I was a bishop in California, we had the Ad Limina visit with Pope Francis, and someone raised that issue with him because he used the word proselytize. He's against proselytizing. And he just made that simple distinction between real evangelization and proselytizing. The latter being a kind of aggressive, disrespectful, domineering approach. We have to avoid that at all costs. I think you winsomely show how intellectually compelling and morally luminous the Catholic tradition is. You live it and you talk about it in a confident and non-domineering way. And I think people find that attractive. So I would recommend putting aside all forms of proselytizing, but welcome all forms of evangelizing.
On a related note, something we're thinking a lot about in campus ministry especially is, what is a kind of authentically Catholic inclusivity look like, right? Inclusivity is kind of one of these secular values that kind of everyone can agree on, but particularly with regard to the LGBTQ community, what is a Catholic university's approach to that community and diverse communities in general look like?
Well, let me say a word first about inclusivity. As you suggest there, it's a word that's borrowed from the secular, very psychologized culture. I would much prefer the terms justice and love. We're a community of justice, which is, I think, the most important of the cardinal virtues. Love, the most important of the theological virtues. Justice is rendering to each his due, right? That's the classical definition. So we're always called upon to be just. It's never right not to be just. You must always be just. Love is willing the good of the other. You must always love in all circumstances. There's never an exception. It's never right not to love. Those are truly absolute values. Inclusivity, it seems to me, is not an absolute value, it's a relative value. Sometimes it's just and loving to include, but not all times. I mean, may I just say something blunt to all the Notre Dame students here? You're included in this community because lots and lots and lots of other people were excluded from it. Am I right? I mean, hey, we're a radically inclusive community. Well, then how about everyone that ever applied to Notre Dame are welcome? It's not true, is it? I mean, and my point is, your being here, I would say, is an expression of justice and love. Those are more important values than inclusivity. It's not to say it's not a value, but it's a relative value. My complaint with the diversity, equity, inclusion stuff is not that those are bad things, but they're not absolute values, they're relative values. When you absolutize them, then trouble emerges. Is diversity a good thing? Sure. But is it absolutely a good thing? No, I would say it's a relative value. Stick with justice and love. Those are absolute values. And that should govern a place, I think, like this, which is coming up out of that great tradition of the cardinal and theological virtues.
Our next question is also from a kind of campus ministry point of view. How does the way in which we celebrate the liturgy here affect what we believe, how we live the rest of our lives? What impact does that have on the lay faithful?
Yeah, and I don't know how you celebrate the liturgy here, so I really can't comment about that. But in general, it should have a massive impact on it. The liturgy, everybody, it's, you know, the medieval cathedrals were meant to look like Noah's Ark, and that's on purpose, because Noah's Ark is a place where a microcosm of God's good order is preserved in the midst of a chaotic world. So the image of the ark bouncing up and down with a microcosm of God's good order. Well, that's why Augustine and Origen and everybody else in the classical church saw it as an image for the church. So we live in a world that's compromised by hatred and cruelty and violence and all these horrible things. But in the church, which is paradigmatically expressed in the liturgy, what do you find? That despite our differences and so on, we come together as one community. We sing together. That's not just like an entertaining traveling music for the celebrant. That's the community. You know what I'm saying? It's the community expressing its harmony, that all these different voices come together. We listen to the Word of God, and we seek to abide by it. Then we listen to the singing of the angels, right, at the Holy Holy. May our voices be one with theirs. So we're linked out of the heavenly realm. And then Christ becomes really, truly, and substantially present, and we eat his body and drink his blood. See, we're being formed in the liturgy as a holy people. And then, just as when Noah's Ark came to rest, they opened the windows and doors and let the life out. So at the end of Mass, the priest says, go, the Mass is ended, go out and Christify the world. So that's why the liturgy is indispensably important in how we're shaped to transform the world. It's not like a little diversion. It's what did Vatican II call it? The source and summit of the Christian life. And that's why, you know. So it's massively important what we do at church.
Let's zoom out a little bit and think about the church more generally. What do you think the church's rich liturgical, theological, and spiritual tradition has to offer, in particular to young American Catholics?
Everything. And I say that, I'm not trying to just be flip. I'm saying that with real enthusiasm because I've been doing this for a long time. And, I mean, you guys know this. There's all these young people in front of me, but all the studies of young people and the increase, the spike right now in anxiety and depression and suicidal thoughts. And you know, there's all kinds of reasons. There's, you know, the internet culture with all of its negativity. And but what I see through all of it is, as I said, the hunger for God. The hunger for God. Everybody has got a hungry heart, as Bruce Springsteen said. I mean, but that's Augustine. That's Augustine. My heart is restless till it rests in thee. And if people aren't fed by God, they will go elsewhere, and it'll do damage to them. There's page 1 to the last page of the Bible. That's the story. You go to the wrong place seeking satisfaction. You're like the woman at the well, right? And Jesus says, you come to this well every day, don't you? And you drink and you're still thirsty. I want to give you water welling up to eternal life. It's the priests of Baal, right? They erect the altars to the gods, and they jump around, and they end up, remember, slashing themselves, and they're bleeding. That's a great metaphor, it seems to me. When you build altars to false gods, and you spend your whole life hopping around them fruitlessly, because the fire will never fall that way. It just won't. But what happens, you get addicted, and you just keep hoping and hoping and hoping and hopping and hopping and cutting, right? And that's a vivid image, seems to me, of the addictive pattern. The way out is the love of God. The way out is coming to the one who will give you water welling up to eternal life. And if the church acquiesces to our marginalization, we are not doing what we're supposed to do. And, the darker sides of secular modernity want us marginalized. They want us privatized. They want us to be a little hobby that we whisper among ourselves. But we're meant to be, what did Jesus say? Salt and light. That's for others. That's for the world. So if we marginalize and privatize ourselves, then we're not doing what we're supposed to do. And then what ensues is a lot of suffering. So that's the role of the church, and we should do it boldly. Paul Tillich said the church should go out, and it is German, mit klingendem Spiel, which means like with fife and drum. And that's right, it seems to me. We shouldn't go out, I'm sorry, and I don't want to offend anybody. And we should go out with fife and drum, because that's our calling. All right, end of harangue on that subject.
Okay, so there are two questions on here that are related. Okay. So the first is, what do you think is the biggest challenge to young adults today, particularly Catholic young adults, and what can a place like this do about it?
I think finding your mission. I mean, that's the great challenge. Find your mission. In the Bible, no one is ever given an experience of God without being sent on mission. I'm with Balthasar, the great theologian, that you don't know who you are until you find your mission. You can have all kinds of names and identities and all that, but they don't mean anything until you find out what God wants you to do. So that's the challenge, is being able to discern, what does God want me to do? So ask for that every day. Those who were at Mass, I talked about, that Jesus says, seek and knock and ask. That's what you should ask for. When Father Hesburgh said, Veni Sancte Spiritus is always the right prayer, well, that's part of it. Come, Holy Spirit, that I might know what you want me to do. So that's the greatest challenge. And look, the purpose of this university is to evangelize. That's every Catholic institution. It's a hospital, it's a school, it's a parish, it's a seminary, it's a university. Every Catholic institution exists to evangelize. So that's it. This university should help you discern your mission, your vocation.
That leads us perfectly into our next question. How do you think the new evangelization has gone? Has it been a success, a failure, a mixed bag, and how can we be part of it?
We don't know yet. I mean, new evangelization begins with Vatican II, it seems to me, and then John Paul II gives it articulate expression. It's picked up by Benedict and then by Francis. We heard it, by the way, from the horse's mouth at that same Ad Limina visit. The Pope said, the key to my pontificate is Evangelii Gaudium, his letter on evangelization. He said, that's the key to reading everything I've done. So I take him at his word. It's too early to tell. I think we just, in a way, just started. But it is the great call of the church now. The new evangelization, meaning new in method, new in ardor, and new in, John Paul gave us three things. But it's the kind of re-evangelization of already evangelized populations. That's the call of our time. But I think it's way too early to know whether it's successful or not.
This question is more from an institutional and administrative perspective. It is sometimes said that universities should not take institutional positions on contested questions of public policy and morality. Should a meaningfully Catholic university be institutionally neutral on such questions?
Well, no, if by that you mean at the moral level, no, of course not. Maybe people doing political science or doing, economics can descend into the details of policy making and all that. But it's not my job, for example, as a bishop, to be pontificating about how tax law is formulated in Minnesota. But it is indeed my job to talk about the moral dimension of public life. So recently, I don't know if you know, in Minnesota, they just passed this horrific abortion law that basically allows abortion for any reason up to and even beyond the birth of the child. Well, yeah, I spoke up very strongly about that. I think we have to. So to that degree, yes, I think a university should take a stance, but we shouldn't do it unless you're an expert in an area in terms of the details of, economics and policy making and all that. So I just make that distinction.
So most of our American Catholic universities are sponsored or run by religious orders. As university enrollment and religious orders continue to shrink, what future do you see the religious orders having in administrative decision-making or in pastoral care of their universities?
They should be central to it seems to me. As I look out at some of the Holy Cross friends here, central to it. I just saw the statue of Father Soren out there. It was kind of a hero of mine. Read, what's his name, Marvin O'Connell's great biography of Soren. What a hero. Extraordinary figure, that braved the horrible winters in the 19th century and built this place up from nothing. I mean, these are extraordinary, heroic figures. And the Holy Cross Order that made this place what it is, and I want them at the very heart of this place. I think they should be the ones articulating a lot of things I talked about. I won't name either the university or the order here, but I was at a university many years ago, and one of the priests there said to me very proudly, we just built a new house for our community, and we purposely moved it really off. It used to be in the center of campus, but now we moved it way down the street. I said, why? Why? It's your university. Why would you move down the street? I don't understand where that came from, this kind of hand-wringing, apologetic. No, it's your Holy Cross. It's your university, and you should give it its heart and soul. So I would encourage the orders to, seize the day.
Right on. What's your biggest hope for the church in the next couple decades?
Well, I guess I'm looking at you, I suppose. It's young people that you would take hold of this great tradition of ours and make it alive. And I'll tell you, maybe this as I think about it. As I started this work in the internet and evangelization, and you have to wade through an awful lot of opposition and people that hate religion and all this. Okay, but in the midst of all that, you also see lots and lots and lots of interest. Do you know this thing on Reddit? It's called AMA, Ask Me Anything. And so people just go on there. I've done it 3 times now, and a lot of people know who I am, but I go on it as I'm a Catholic bishop that loves talking to atheists and non-believers. And the 3 times I've done it, I've been, I think, number 2 and number 3 and number 2 in the country after like Jordan Peterson and Bernie Sanders. And my point is not that they think, Robert, they don't know who I am, but that a Catholic bishop sort of went out there. Well, I mean, the tens of thousands of people that get on that with, yes, obscenities and yes, opposition, but a lot of good, honest questions and interest. And that gives me hope when I see that the hundreds of millions of views on YouTube and various things, people, they're still interested. We still have the words of eternal life. That's the point, The church still has the words of eternal life, and so that gives me hope.
All right, I've got 2 questions here, and I feel like I should introduce these people to each other, because one is really worried about the vocations shortage in the United States, and the other one wants to know how to discern God's will for his life. So,
good, we'll get them together.
So could you speak about either of those realities?
Yeah. Well, how to discern, a lot of my priesthood was spent on that question doing seminary work. Go to Galatians chapter 5, I would say, and look at the fruits of the Holy Spirit, love, joy, peace, and equanimity, and so on. What is it in your life that's producing those? That's what you should do. If you look at 2 paths in your life and you say, boy, that one path, I'm more peaceful, I'm more hopeful, I'm more loving, I'm more, balanced when I'm on that path. And when I'm on this path, I look at the fruits of the unclean spirit, So use Galatians 5 to see which path is making you more alive. Listen to people around you. They often know better than you. They can see something in you that you can't see in yourself. Trust when people say, hey, I think you'd be a good priest, or no, I think you should get married. Or I think you should listen to people around you, But I use Galatians 5. Here's one from Thomas Merton. It's hard, but he said if you have two choices, the harder one, that's what God wants. Now, and what's right about that, it seems to me, is look, we're all sinners, and God always wants more and more love, more and more self-gift, and that's always harder. So you have option A, option B. Option B is harder. That's the one that's calling forth more love. And that's the basic answer. What makes you more loving? That's the path you want to follow.
Many people refer to you as the modern day, as the modern day Fulton Sheen. Are there aspects of Venerable Sheen's ministry that you try to imitate?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sheen to me is fascinating. One thing I really think is very important about Fulton Sheen is how smart he was. He had the agrégé degree from Louvain, the advanced doctorate. G.K. Chesterton wrote the preface to Sheen's first book, which I think is really interesting. Taught philosophy and theology for 20 years at Catholic U. Before he did his media work, he was super formed in the Catholic intellectual tradition, and that's what gave him his power. Now, he had all these gifts as an orator and all that, but it was his grounding in the intellectual tradition. People come to me all the time and say, hey, I want to do what you're doing. I want to go on YouTube and the internet. And I'll say, no. Books, 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 books. Begin with the old technology. Take out a book with pages and read it, But get grounded. That's what I think I learned from Sheen, is be really grounded in the intellectual tradition before you do it. There's a lot of flashy stuff online that might be superficially attractive but not very nutritious. So I take that from Sheen very much. His sense of humor too. He had a great sense of humor, and the great comics of the mid 20th century admired him. Milton Berle and Jackie Gleason, and they admired Sheen's wit. So I think that's another thing I learned from him.
All right, this is more related to the topic of your lecture tonight. So two kind of core texts in Catholic thinking about what a Catholic university ought to look like are obviously St. John Paul II's Ex Cordia Ecclesia, and then we have the famous Land O'Lakes statement, which our own Father Hesburgh was very involved in. Is there a way in which these two documents can be harmonized? Are there ways in which they're at odds with each other? And which document do you see as kind of more of a way forward for Catholic universities today?
Well, that's invite me back for another lecture for that one, or ask Father Miss Campbell. Those who are at Mass know my great admiration for Father Hesburgh, and it's sincere. I think he was one of the great Catholics of the 20th century. I didn't like him on Land O'Lakes. I'm a Ex Cordia Ecclesiae person, so I think the universities come out of the heart of the church, and we should not construe the church as an outside aggressor that's somehow attacking the academic freedom of a university. To me, that's a very modern way of understanding freedom and the nature of a university and the church. So I think those are faulty understandings. Central to John Paul's teaching was the harmony between freedom and truth, right? Because modern freedom means self-creation. It's rampant today, by the way. I'm free in the measure that no one tells me what to do and I invent things. That's not biblical or classical freedom. A better metaphor there would be, I'm free to play the piano I'm ever freer to play it. How? Because I just decide to play any way I want. No, the more I've internalized the truths of the piano, the more I've internalized the laws of the piano, the freer I become to play. Or I'm a free speaker of English, more or less, because I've internalized grammar and syntax and vocabulary and all this over many, many years. It's made me free. That's what John Paul saw, that freedom and truth come together. My concern about Land O'Lakes is that it's a very modern understanding of freedom as kind of self-direction, and therefore the church was seen as an outside aggressor to that. And I think that's faulty, and we shouldn't approach the question that way. And I think it still haunts us to some degree. It still haunts the way we think about the church in relation to the academy. So I'm not a fan of Land O'Lakes.
All right, I have one final question for you.
Okay.
This is Our Ladies University. We've got a ton of undergraduates here. How can we be true Notre Dame students in the most literal sense of the word, students of Our Lady?
Yeah, that's good. She went in haste. Mary takes in the word of the angel, and then she went in haste because she knew what she had to do and she knew who she was. And she didn't hold back, and she took on her mission. Good. You want to reach the point in your life where you can say, I'm going to go in haste. I know who I am. I know what I'm about. And Mary found her mission in saying, behold, I'm the handmaid of the Lord. Be it done to me according to thy word. Now, mind you, look at our culture now. Me. I choose. It's up to me. I decide. It's I. You don't tell me. You tolerate me, and I'll tolerate you, but don't tell me what to do. That's inimical to the classical tradition of, no, I am most myself when I surrender to the non-competitive power of God. When God has invaded my life in such a way that I can say, now I know who I am, and I'm going to go in haste. The second thing about the Blessed Mother, she treasured these things in her heart. So Newman took that as the sign that Mary was the patroness of all theology. So Mary takes in the data of Revelation, and she doesn't say, all right, well, whatever that was, she treasured those things in her heart, and she thought about them very deeply indeed. And that's why she's the sede sapientiae, we say, right? She's the seat of wisdom. And why it's wonderful that she presides over this whole campus. And, it's no accident that a hero like Soren, decides we're going to dedicate this place to Notre Dame. She went in haste and she treasured these things in her heart. And those are two great things for everybody in this room. So maybe that's it.
Please join me in thanking Bishop Robert Barron.